This week we're dealing with garter stitch borders that flip out. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. Garter stitch is frequently used as a border for knitted projects because it will lie flat, but many knitters are surprised and frustrated to discover that their garter stitch borders flip out. That is, instead of lying flat, they fold at that transition between the garter stitch and the stockinette like this. Today we're going to talk about why that happens and what you can do to prevent that flip or at least minimize it. Let's get started. So what I have here are two swatches that were knit very similarly, but each edge has a difference, and these have not been washed and blocked yet. So you can see that for both of these swatches, the cast on edge is actually folding over, where for the bind off edges, they're just kind of lifting up a little bit. So I want to go through each of these edges and explain how they were done. With this swatch, I cast on with a size 7 needle. I cast on 30 stitches. I worked 3 garter stitch ridges, so that's 6 rows. And then I just worked the edges in garter stitch and then worked the center in stockinette. What you'll see here is that this edge is bowing down like that, and it's causing the edges here to flare out, which then causes the garter stitch to compress. The reason it's doing that is because my stitch gauge for garter stitch is wider than for stockinette. Because this is wider, it has to go somewhere. So it pushes down and then it flips up. What I did up at the top was in my first row of garter stitch, I did a knit 2 together in 2 places to even out the gauge more. What you'll notice here is that these edges, first of all, are straighter, and the cast off, the bind off edge is a little straighter. It's not perfect, but again, it hasn't been washed or blocked yet. What I did here was I cast on with a size 6 needle, cast on the full 30 stitches, worked 3 ridges again in garter stitch, and then I switched my needle size, and then I switched to working the stockinette in the middle. And what I did up here at the top was to work 4 ridges of garter stitch rather than 3, and that just wants to, I can make it kind of come up if I wanted to, but it wants to mostly lie flat. So we'll see what happens after these have been washed and blocked. So here are the 2 swatches after blocking. I should mention that I knit these in 100% wool, which means they are much more amenable to blocking than synthetic fibers would be. So on the surface, they all look perfectly fine, but let's take a closer look. This is that first one. I was able to, that was all worked on a size 7 needle. I was able to block this straight, but you'll notice that it's still wider here because I didn't shrink it. I just was able to get it to lie flat. So it's still wider, and the wider this fabric would get, the more stitches I would add, the more that difference would magnify. Because I have stockinette stitch here and garter stitch is a very horizontal stitch pattern, the wider that got, the more likely it would be to want to flip again. If I were to use a stitch pattern in here that was not so flat, what could happen instead is that this edge would end up ruffling rather than trying to flip. In either case, it wouldn't look good. But what we can see at the top here is that we still have those straight lines that we were looking for, and this lies flat. So by reducing a couple of stitches to compensate for the gauge difference, that really ended up working out well. These look like they're both lying flat. What happens with this one, as I play with it a little bit, is that this edge doesn't want to lie perfectly, like I'm sliding my finger under here without touching it. So it's not really lying flat, where with the one that's a little bit longer with 2 extra garter stitch rows, I can lift it up and let it go. So the takeaway from this is that either method will work, either reducing the needle size or reducing the stitch count. And in this case, it helped to add a couple of extra rows, because this, with the smaller needle size, ended up being too narrow to really combat the flip completely. So there are a couple of important points here. Number one, synthetic fibers are less amenable to blocking than natural fibers are. The width of the border needs to match the width of the main body of the fabric. That means you may need to compensate for a difference in gauges, either by knitting fewer stitches for the top and bottom borders, or by using a smaller needle to knit the borders. And the last thing I want to mention is that stockinette has a very strong desire to roll. So if you are going to combine stockinette with a garter stitch border, it's best if the fabric is square-ish. You're going to have trouble if the project is very long and thin, like a 6-foot long scarf that's 8 inches wide, or if it's very short and wide, because in both cases, the desire for the stockinette to want to roll into a tube is not going to be prevented by having a garter stitch border. The garter stitch border will be flat and straight, but the entire project will either be rolled into a tube horizontally or vertically. What this means is that stockinette is not always an appropriate stitch pattern for every project. You may have better luck if you're working some sort of rectangular flat project if you use a stitch pattern that combines knits and purls on each side of the fabric more evenly. Well, that's it for today. Now, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I'd really appreciate it if you did. You can hover over my face and then click on subscribe, or if you're on a mobile device, you can tap on my face and then tap on subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.